Module 6, Part 2. We continue our conversation on impact on populations disproportionately impacted by crises with a look at our ethical and regulatory issues. So in emergency management, there is also a need to review ethical questions. How do we ethically determine allocation and distribution of benefits and burdens? How do we determine the fairness of unintended consequences? What is the public participation by affected individuals? Determining roles of responsibility and duty, and what are our limits on duty for self-preservation? And what are our private responsibilities versus our public duties? Further, to whom is a duty owed? How do we enforce limitations on individual rights? Curfew, quarantine, evacuation? We have certainly seen through all of the I don't want to use the word riots, but sadly that's what it's become in many parts of the country over the summer of 2020, are peaceful protests in an attempt to look at Black Lives Matter, or curfews as a result of some of those protests, quarantines as a result of COVID-19. And of course, there's always evacuation in times of storms. Again, I live in the South, so it's often hurricanes. Up north, you may have an issue often in the spring thaw with people living near large rivers in Minnesota. There's often the need to evacuate. So what duty of communication warning is owed to the public? And what is the duty of the media in disseminating messages about risk? And I refer you back to our previous modules where we talked about communication and how not to oversell and not also undersell. To aid ethical decision-making, have a predetermined framework. This chart gives a nice overview. Use the guiding principles of fairness, openness, reciprocity, proportionality, flexibility. Make sure it's evidence-based, and respect your community norms and culture. Also note, each profession has an ethical code of conduct with core values of respect, commitment, and professionalism. So if you become a healthcare administrator, make sure you review those codes of conduct, particularly if you say join the American College of Healthcare Executives or organizations for long-term care professionals, etc. And don't forget the journalist. Without doubt, passing on warnings is the clearest, most consistent role of mass media in disaster. Seek the truth and report it, minimize harm, act independently, and be accountable. There are a lot of regulatory requirements for licensed agencies, and each organizational type may have its own accreditation and licensure requirements, in addition to what you need to follow for city, county, state, and federal requirements. And disaster plans are part of any type of agency, as well as business continuity plans, the COOP, as I provided the acronym earlier. So again, be familiar with whatever type of organization you're part of, that particular organization's requirements as regards regulations and standards. During times of emergency preparedness, we need to examine personnel, access to treatment, coordination of care, patients' interests, etc. And we will do this over the next few slides. And this comes from the National Academy's Press, Crisis Standards of Care, a Systems Framework for Catastrophic Disaster Response. Personnel during crisis. How are employees, independent contractors, and volunteers legally distinguished for the purpose of coordinating services and benefits during an emergency? Do existing labor contracts or union requirements affect the ability of the entity and its personnel to respond to an emergency? Have appropriate contractual or other mechanisms been executed to facilitate the delivery of services, to ensure safety or ensure availability, compensation, or other benefits during an emergency? So you really need to examine how are your personnel treated during this unfortunate time, which may change the rules. And for those needing access to treatment during crisis, so what's your strategy for conducting triage under legal requirements for treating existing and forthcoming patients? What's your preparation to screen and potentially divert excess numbers of patients during an emergency consistent with Emergency Medical Treatment and Active Labor Act, EMTALA? And be sure to be familiar with EMTALA. Absent its waiver during a declared emergency. Do healthcare personnel who are designated to treat existing and forthcoming patients pose any risks to patients, either through exposure to infectious or other conditions, or the use of personal protective equipment that may impede the delivery of medical services? This last bullet really speaks to me at this moment, and depending on when you're reviewing these slides, If you're in the summer of 2020, you are certainly experiencing a pandemic unlike any that we've seen during our lifetimes, because none of us were alive during the Spanish flu. And we know that there's been great exposure to infectious diseases. Many, many healthcare workers have gotten the COVID. Many sadly have died from it. And the personal protective equipment, PPE, has not always been as available as needed. So there's lots of issues surrounding treatment. And how do we coordinate health services during a crisis? Are healthcare personnel aware of the legal effects of a shift to crisis standards of care and changes relating to scopes of practice during a declared emergency? It is a bit different, so make sure you know what the difference is for your organization between under normal operating times versus a crisis. Are healthcare personnel knowledgeable about conditions related to the issuance of emergency use authorizations by the FDA, including accompanying mandatory emergency use information for patients and providers? And do you have adequate mechanisms in place to ensure compliance with surveillance, reporting, testing, screening, partner notification? That was particularly big and may still be with the AIDS, HIV, quarantine, isolation, and other public health mandates during emergencies. So much of this rings so true right now, given that the pandemic is an ongoing crisis of major proportions, none like we've ever seen, as it affects the whole country and the whole world. Are legal issues concerning the use of volunteer health professionals during emergency addressed through the entity's emergency plan? If you recall, in New York, the Governor Cuomo issued a special allowance for those that were recently retired, perhaps didn't keep their license up because they needed volunteers to allow them to come back and work safely and not be judged in case of the crisis with something not going well. Patients' interest during crisis. Can patients with physical or mental disabilities be accommodated during the emergency consistent with disability protection laws? Do they have adequate access to available medical countermeasures to ensure their health and safety? And are there appropriate measures in place for attempting to ascertain patients' informed consent? Barring waiver of national, state, or local privacy laws through emergency declarations, are the entity and its personnel prepared to respect the patient's health information privacy rights during an emergency? And are you prepared to evacuate at-risk patients in response to an emergency? All of these particular bullets are critically important to know how your organization is going to address each. Allocation of resources during a crisis. This has become big, again, during COVID-19, and it always is major when a whole town is destroyed by a flood, fire, etc. Is there a legitimate process for determining allocation of limited resources that is fair, reasonable, non-discriminatory, and credibly based on protecting the health of patients and the public? And are there federal, state, or local policies regarding resource allocation that should be followed? And can the government appropriate existing resources with just compensation for communal purposes during an emergency? And don't forget about liability during a crisis. When may the entity and its personnel be liable for their actions in treating patients under crisis standards of care during an emergency? Just because it's an emergency doesn't mean you can throw the book out on how to properly care and treat patients or personnel. But there are certain emergency protocols put in place so that you can treat them. What legal protections from liability for entities, their healthcare personnel, independent contractors, and volunteers, including insurance, apply during an emergency? And may entities and their personnel face potential liability for failure to adequately plan or train for emergencies? This is why your training is so critical. And so just again, be familiar with what the laws are in your current area as regards how they change, particularly during a crisis or an emergency. This one always has our finance people worried. How do you get reimbursed during a crisis? Do you have established protocols for treating patients? Are private health insurers or other payers legally required to reimburse for care delivered to patients in furtherance of the public's health? And are entities organized to seek federal and state reimbursement through the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services, Federal Emergency Management Agency, or other sources for care delivered in off-site facilities operated by the entity? And have federal state authorities accelerated, altered, or waived Medicare, Medicaid requirements for reimbursement during emergency? As I recall, one of the things that has happened during COVID is that Medicare is willing, and maybe Medicaid too, is willing to pay for your COVID tests. Again, in the sense of assuring the public's health. Then you have interjurisdictional cooperation during a crisis. So do you have memos of understanding, mutual aid agreements, or other agreements to make sure that you can coordinate emergency healthcare services? Are these agreements consistent with federal Department of Health and Human Services, Secretary of Preparedness and Response, or Centers for Medicaid, etc., or other government entities? Is the entity's all hazards emergency plan integrated with community-level emergency planning and objectives? And have state or local governments on international borders addressed specific concerns through lawful agreements across borders? Now, I happen to work in upstate New York, and part of our border did touch Canada, as does a lot of our northern states like Minnesota. And those individuals that are living right on the border may find it easier to access services across that border, either direction. So it's always important, and especially given we have very different systems of healthcare, to understand what can happen during a crisis or an emergency. Okay, that was a lot to cover in a brief period of time. Feel free to always peruse or pause your slide sets when you're looking at them. And now be sure to watch the YouTube video interview with Jody Boyne, Vice President, Public Relations, Leading Age Minnesota, on vulnerable populations, and also a video by our very own Professor Rajan Moon. And that ends Module 6.